It was an evening like any other at La Poche, one of the city's most exclusive restaurants. Known for its lavish interiors, gourmet dishes, and clientele of the rich and famous. Crystal chandeliers glimmered overhead, casting a warm golden glow on the plush velvet chairs and polished marble floors. The air was filled with soft music and the murmurs of high society conversations. The waiters, dressed in crisp uniforms, moved gracefully between tables, attending to the needs of their well-dressed patrons. Business moguls discussed deals over expensive wine, while socialites gossiped about the latest trends. It was a world where appearances meant everything, and the wealthier you appeared, the more respect you commanded. Then, something unusual happened. The grand double doors of La Poche swung open, and in walked a woman who was different. She wasn't dressed in the designer brands that everyone else seemed to flaunt. Her outfit was simple, a modest dress, worn but clean. A small, plain leather bag hung from her shoulder, and her hair, though neatly tied back, lacked the polished perfection that the other women in the restaurant clearly spent hours achieving. Her name was Anya. As she walked through the restaurant, heads turned. Whispers began to ripple through the room like a wave. The patrons exchanged looks of disdain, their voices low but loud enough for Anya to hear. "Who let her in here? Is she lost? She looks like she doesn't belong. What's she doing in a place like this?" Some even laughed openly, their eyes following her every step, as if waiting for her to trip or make a mistake. Anya, however, remained composed. She approached the hostess, who hesitated before showing her to a small table in the corner. The mockery didn't stop. At the tables nearby, the snide remarks continued. "She's probably here to ask for a handout. Maybe she thinks she can get a free meal. Bet she's never even tasted real champagne." Anya sat down quietly, her back straight and her eyes calm. She took a deep breath and waved over the waiter, who approached her with visible skepticism. His posture stiffened and his smile was clearly forced. "Yes, ma'am. What would you like to order?" he asked, his tone clipped. "I'll have the house salad and a glass of water," Anya said simply, folding her hands in her lap. The waiter raised an eyebrow. "Just that? That will be all, thank you." He turned away, clearly unimpressed. The tables around her continued their chatter, louder now, emboldened by her modest order. "House salad? What a joke! Why is she even here?" But Anya didn't react. She sat in serene silence, her gaze occasionally drifting to the grand chandelier above or the elegant paintings on the wall. She didn't seem bothered by the looks or the whispers. In fact, she almost seemed to be observing them. As she waited for her meal, the air around her buzzed with contempt. But Anya knew something they didn't. She wasn't here by accident. She wasn't out of place. This restaurant, La Poche, wasn't just a random choice for a night out. She had a reason for being here, and it was much bigger than anyone in that room could have guessed. The waiter brought Anya's order, a simple house salad and a glass of water. He set it down with a thin smile, as though he couldn't quite believe someone would come to a high-end restaurant for such a modest meal. "Enjoy," he muttered, before quickly turning away, eager to return to the more important guests. Anya quietly thanked him and began to eat, unfazed by the continued stares and whispers around her. Her movements were calm, deliberate. She wasn't rushing, nor was she shrinking from the attention. In fact, she looked oddly at peace, as if none of the judgment swirling around her could touch her. But the rest of the restaurant wasn't so calm. At the table next to hers, a well-dressed couple exchanged amused glances. The man, clad in an expensive suit, smirked as he leaned closer to his companion. "She's clearly in over her head. Maybe she's trying to see how the other half lives," he said, loud enough for Anya to hear. The woman with him, dripping in diamonds, laughed softly. "It's pathetic, really. You'd think someone like that would know better than to step into a place like this. It's almost as if she's asking to be humiliated." Anya's hand paused briefly over her salad, but she still didn't respond. Instead, she let their words hang in the air, as if she were waiting for something. A few more minutes passed, and the tension in the room seemed to thicken. Some patrons were now openly pointing at her, their faces twisted in either amusement or disgust. It was as if they were watching a performance, expecting Anya to make a fool of herself, to confirm their low expectations. But she didn't falter. Instead, she wiped her mouth with her napkin, took a final sip of her water, and pushed her plate gently away. Then she stood up. At first, no one noticed. A few people glanced her way, expecting her to quietly leave, head bowed in shame. But instead, Anya walked to the center of the room. She stood under the grand chandelier, the soft light catching the calmness in her eyes. She paused for a moment, surveying the room, and then cleared her throat. "I'd like to say something," she began, her voice clear and steady. The room fell silent. The other patrons blinked in surprise, taken aback by her sudden boldness. Whispers halted mid-sentence, forks clattered awkwardly onto plates, and all eyes turned toward her. Anya met their gazes without flinching. There was no anger in her expression, no bitterness, only a quiet strength that seemed to make the room hold its breath. "I'm sure some of you have noticed me tonight," she said, her voice even, though there was a softness to her words that somehow made them hit harder. "And I've noticed you as well." A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly unsure of where this was going. "I've heard the whispers, the jokes, the assumptions. I could see the judgments in your eyes from the moment I walked in. You all assumed you knew me because of the way I look, because of the way I'm dressed. You think I don't belong here." Silence spread like wildfire through the restaurant. Some looked away, suddenly unable to meet her gaze, while others stared, trying to figure out what was happening. Anya smiled slightly, but there was no malice in it, just a quiet understanding. "I didn't come here for validation or to prove anything to anyone, but I think it's important that you all know something." She took a breath, letting the weight of her words settle before continuing. "You see, I'm not here as a customer. I'm not here to beg or to steal, as some of you might have thought." The tension in the room was palpable now. The patrons leaned in, their curiosity piqued, though many still looked skeptical. "I'm here for a much different reason," Anya continued. "You see, I'm the owner of this restaurant." A collective gasp rippled through the room. The man in the expensive suit sat up straighter, his eyes widening in disbelief. The woman covered in diamonds paled visibly, her hand flying to her mouth as if to stifle a gasp. The waiter, who had served Anya earlier with thinly veiled disdain, stood frozen, his tray trembling slightly in his hands. Anya didn't stop. "La Poche is part of a chain of restaurants that I built from the ground up," she said, her voice unwavering. "I started with nothing, and over the years I worked tirelessly to create something of value, something that people from all walks of life could enjoy. I'm here tonight because I wanted to see how the staff and the patrons treated someone they thought didn't belong." The room seemed to contract, as if the walls were closing in on the guests who had spent the evening mocking her. Some of them looked mortified, their faces flushed with embarrassment. Anya's eyes swept across the room, landing on each person who had ridiculed her. "I've seen enough to know that things need to change, not just in this restaurant, but in the way we see each other. Wealth and appearance don't define a person's worth." The entire restaurant was now eerily silent, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone present. They had judged her without knowing her story, and now they were left to grapple with the consequences of their assumptions. For a moment, it felt as though time had stopped inside La Poche. The grand restaurant, usually filled with the laughter of the elite, was now enveloped in a thick silence. Every eye was fixed on Anya, the woman they had mocked and dismissed. The woman who, just moments ago, they believed didn't belong among them. Now she stood before them as the very owner of the establishment they so revered. Anya took another breath, her composure unbroken. The weight of her words had hung in the air, heavy with the truth that none of them had anticipated. As she looked at the faces before her, some still frozen in shock, others beginning to show signs of shame, she spoke again. This time, her voice softer, but no less powerful. "I didn't come here to humiliate anyone," she began, her eyes softening as she looked at the couple who had openly mocked her, the suited man now pale, the diamond-clad woman staring at her napkin, unable to meet her gaze. "I came here to remind us all of something we so easily forget. Appearances can deceive, but character, how we treat others, is what truly defines us." A ripple of unease ran through the crowd. The patrons, who had moments ago felt so confident in their judgments, now sat with slumped shoulders, their pride visibly deflating under the weight of their assumptions. Anya stepped forward, her voice steady, yet filled with emotion. "I've spent my entire life fighting to prove that worth isn't found in wealth or expensive clothes. I came from nothing. I grew up not knowing when my next meal would come, and I worked my way up, scrubbing floors, working late nights, so that I could one day create something meaningful. This restaurant isn't just a business to me. It's a symbol of every hardship I overcame, every obstacle that was thrown my way. And yet, despite all that, tonight I was judged, not for who I am, but for what I wore." A woman in the back wiped away a tear. The cold atmosphere that had once dominated the room was now melting into something far more fragile. Guilt, perhaps, or regret. "I know what it's like to be on the outside, looking in," Anya continued, her voice trembling slightly, as though she were recalling painful memories. "I know what it feels like to be told you don't belong, to be treated as if you're less simply because you don't fit into someone else's mold. But what we all forget is that every person has a story. Every person, no matter how they look, has value." As Anya's words filled the room, the people who had once laughed and pointed at her now looked down, avoiding her gaze. Some were blinking back tears, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. They had come to La Poche to flaunt their wealth, to enjoy the luxury, never expecting that the evening would turn into a mirror reflecting their own flaws. The waiter who had served Anya earlier suddenly took a step forward, his face pale, his hands trembling. I didn't know," he stammered, his voice thick with guilt. "I treated you like—" Anya smiled at him, cutting him off gently. "It's all right. You were only doing what you thought was expected of you. But perhaps now you understand why it's important to see beyond the surface." The waiter nodded, his face red with shame. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and though the words were quiet, they seemed to echo in the heavy silence of the restaurant. Anya's gaze turned back to the room, her expression still calm, still kind. "I'm not asking for apologies. I don't want anyone to feel humiliated tonight. What I want is for us to learn from this, to be better. It's so easy to judge, so easy to assume we know someone's story based on a first glance. But the truth is, we never really know what someone is going through, what battles they're fighting." The room was utterly still now. The patrons hung on her every word, their earlier arrogance replaced with a deep, undeniable sense of remorse. "And if there's one thing I hope you all take away from tonight," Anya continued, her voice thick with emotion, "it's that kindness, true kindness, costs nothing. We all carry burdens. We all have struggles. Sometimes the person you judge the most is the one who needs your compassion the most. You never know whose heart you could be touching with just a little bit of grace." At that, a murmur went through the room, not of judgment, but of quiet reflection. The couple who had laughed at her earlier exchanged glances, their faces flushed with embarrassment. The businessman who had openly ridiculed her ran a hand through his hair, his gaze cast downward, no longer able to hide behind his wealth. Anya took one last look around the room, her eyes gentle yet filled with purpose. This restaurant may belong to me in name, but in spirit it belongs to every person who walks through its doors, rich or poor, well-dressed or modest. Everyone deserves to feel welcome here. That's why I built it." With those final words, she turned and began to walk toward the exit. The room remained silent as she moved, every step echoing off the marble floor. But just as she reached the door, something unexpected happened. The patrons, those who had once looked down on her, began to stand. One by one, they rose to their feet, heads bowed in respect, their pride shattered by the realization of their own pettiness. It wasn't just a gesture of apology. It was an acknowledgement of the strength and grace they had witnessed in Anya. As she reached the door, the once silent room erupted in applause. Soft at first, but then growing louder, filled with admiration for the woman who had taught them all a lesson in humility, compassion, and the power of character. Anya paused at the door, turning to look back at the room. A small, genuine smile played on her lips as she nodded once, accepting their gesture, not as validation, but as a step toward change. Then, without another word, she stepped out into the night, leaving behind a room full of people forever changed by the presence of the woman they had once misjudged.